ideas enshrined here are not representing anyone's opinion but my own. So these are my own thoughts, contributions, and whatnot. With that said, this can be highly, let's say, faulty. So if you have any critical remarks, any questions, anything that you don't agree with, I'm very happy to listen to your questions and hopefully answer some of them if I'm able, and also feel free to debate me on any of these issues. However, as our honorable principal has just said, human rights are a vast territory. So without exploring everything there is regarding human rights, I have just brought 3 smaller segments of how human rights can be affected by peacekeeping. And these 3 topics are going to be, first of all, women's rights, how women can be understood in the peacekeeping framework, so not just as protected persons, but we'll see some other connotations as well. Secondly, the right to health, so specifically how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected peace operations. And third, last but not least, we're going to endeavor to see how sexual exploitation and abuse is threatening the livelihood and the well-being of those people who are on the field, who are the civilian population in these peace operations. So let's get started. First of all, why are some of these phenomena? Why do some of these phenomena exist? And that's because peacekeeping has changed very rapidly over the course of the last 30 years. It's no longer a rapid process, an easy process where individuals are being sent from a lot of countries and they are just dividing the combating parties, just separating them from the armed conflict. But peacekeeping is a long-term endeavor, meaning that those peacekeepers are generally there for at least a decade, sometimes more. The average lifespan of some of the modern peace operations rests between around 10, 13, 15 years, which means that peacekeepers are going to stay there for a longer period of time, and they will have an extended possibility and capacity and duties to engage with the local population, which means that they are also responsible for the maintenance of human rights from a practical point of view and from a legal point of view, because the protection of human rights is also enshrined in almost all of the UN Security Council resolutions mandating the existence of these peace operations. So we can, just as a short assessment, we can say that the maintenance of human rights is now one of the core functions of any UN peacekeeping force. However, the UN has recognized that it's not just enough to send peacekeepers there. You have to have a reconstruction process. And that reconstruction process will also affect how human rights are being treated in that country. And this is called the idea of positive peace, that it's not enough to have just a lack of armed conflict, but you also need to have the incremental stages, at least, of nation building, of building a functioning political system, a civil administration, but also we need to have working opportunities, opportunities. We have to have a functioning economy, trade. We have to alleviate intercultural and interreligious conflicts, and so on. This takes time, this takes energy and effort. However, what the UN Secretary General is emphasizing in all of his speeches is that peacekeeping is first and foremost something that he calls a nationally owned political solution. So the UN is not trying to enforce even human rights standards on these countries. The UN is trying to promote human rights. And if you have a legal, let's say, hearing, then you can understand the difference between these two words. You're not forcing it, you are promoting it. You are making sure that the people understand the value of human rights on their own, and they will be following some of the key documents, such as the International Bill of Rights and some other key documents, maybe signing and ratifying relevant international treaties, and of course the most important step is implementing them into their own little legal systems. So that's the overarching idea of what we're trying to address today. Now, the UN has a lot of tools at its disposal. So what you might hear a lot of in media is that the UN is not capable of doing a lot of things, for example, between Russia and Ukraine, between Israel and Palestine. But it certainly has a lot of tools that it is capable of promoting. For example, new international treaties are currently, let's say, being discussed and deliberated, not just at the UN level, but also through other entities and organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross regarding autonomous weapon systems using artificial intelligence-based technology. So these are some of the initiatives that are currently ongoing. It's very likely that for the next couple of years we might not see results, but the UN and its experts are working in the background trying to make sure that we have a comprehensive and forward-looking system as possible. However, the UN also has sanctions regime. So in some cases, for example, if a state is non-compliant with what the UN has been doing, then the UN can also impose military sanctions as well on those countries. Iraq, Libya, North Korea were some of the examples in the past. Or economic sanctions, again, North Korea, Iran, and several other states all around the world which have not complied with relevant Security Council resolutions, and so they were targeted by sanctions. Now bear in mind that the composition of the UN Security Council will play a very heavy role in who gets to have sanctions imposed on them or not. Essentially, if you don't have meaningful friends in the form of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, then you can be targeted by sanctions. But that's a different topic, and that's not strictly related to human rights, although it does have some human rights contributions as well. However, what is worth noting is that the UN can promote these at the same time, almost all of them at the same time. In the case of Mali, for example, or Haiti, let's take a look at Haiti because that's the newest example. There is a continuous humanitarian assistance arriving to the country since the earthquakes of 2010. There was a UN peace operation there between 2005 and 2017, and lately Kenya has also deployed its own peacekeeping police officers to the region just this year. So these can work in tandem, in parallel, depending on the need. So the UN system, although the most obvious thing is to see is the debilitation of the UN Security Council, the paralysis by the 5 permanent members, still there are lots of other tools that the UN can use to make sure that the situation is remedied. And today we're only focusing on peacekeeping and only some human rights aspect of peace operations. Now bear in mind that when we are talking about peace operations, the image that comes to mind is the blue UN flag and the blue helmets. However, peacekeepers are not just military, but they're also a very diverse bunch of people. They employ, for example, observers, they employ police officers, the aid workers belonging to specialized agencies, administrators belonging to the secretariat, volunteers, and I'm winking to the students here, if you want to get affiliated with the UN, one of the best ways to start is being a volunteer, because then you can get to know how the system works and decide for yourself whether you want to work there later down the line or not. And if you already have some experience with working for the UN, even as an unpaid volunteer, you will have better chances of joining the UN later on. So this means that peacekeepers are a diverse bunch. However, from a human rights standpoint, this also means that different human rights standards will be applicable to them as well. And the UN is trying to homogenize these obligations, but under certain circumstances, and because of the different legal framework, sometimes this is not possible. For example, regarding the military and police component, these will be bound by the so-called status of forces agreements, in which the sending country is going to be the one who will decide which rules, which norms it will apply to its own citizens. The UN can recommend some basic concepts to them, but it cannot enforce them, because these peacekeepers, the military and police component, will have what we call immunity, which means a complete protection from any local criminal or civil or administrative process, very much akin to diplomatic immunity enjoyed by heads of state, heads of government, diplomatic agents, and of course heads of international organizations as well. For civilian contractors, for example, the UN is mandating human rights standards in their contract, meaning that if those contractors who are responsible for the maintenance of, let's say, the cafeteria or the driver services, if they breach human rights, then so those contracts can be terminated with immediate effect, and some compensation will have to be paid. Of course, If that violation of human right is very serious, for example, torture or the debasement of human dignity, cancelling the contract and having some financial compensation might not be sufficient. But at this moment, the UN can only recommend local authorities to take action and not take these actions into its own hands. Why? Because the UN doesn't have a criminal justice system. You might think that, oh, we have heard something about an international criminal court, but bear in mind that the International Criminal Court, with its roughly dozen cases over 20 years, is reserved for the most serious violators of international crimes. So the level you have to achieve is at least war crimes, crimes against humanity, or genocide to be eligible to be brought before the International Criminal Court. It's not an everyday people's criminal court where you can be brought. On a side note, bringing peacekeepers before the International Criminal Court for alleged war crimes might not encourage states to participate in future peace operations. That's just a side note to the issue. Of course, we can also ask ourselves that there are severe human rights problems in a lot of countries, so why don't we have peace operations in a lot of areas which desperately require international help and attention? To note some of these examples, for example, Ukraine. Why don't we have an international peace operation in Ukraine? Well, because one of the core principles of any peace operation is consent. But even before consent, you have to have peace to keep. That's why it's called peacekeeping. Do we have peace in Ukraine? Well, not. That's an ongoing armed conflict for well over 2 years now. So if we have peace, then we can have peacekeepers. If the country, in case of a domestic armed conflict, a non-international armed conflict, or in the case of an international armed conflict, if both sides agree. So those two are the prerequisites of any peace operation. The same reason can be observed, for example, regarding Israel and Palestine. Still, the conflict hasn't resolved yet, and sending peacekeepers to an active combat zone will mean little. It will only mean that they themselves can be parties to that armed conflict in a way that they can be targeted, which is not a healthy option for any international personnel there. To use another example, for example, Afghanistan. Of course, since 2021, with the Taliban takeover, the country's situation has not improved from a human rights point of view, especially the right to education and women's rights in taking part in everyday life, limiting the availability of, for example, living without scarves and the hijab and all those vestments. So can we send peacekeepers to Afghanistan? Not really, because there is no consent by the Taliban, who is the de facto government. Plus, complicating things, the UN has not recognized the Taliban as a legitimate government of the country. And third, but not least, let's be realistic. Who would like to go to Afghanistan? Because the British tried it, the Soviets tried it, and the Americans tried it, and they were not exactly successful in those endeavors. So convincing states to send peacekeepers, even if we had consent, would be very hard. Now, as time is fleeting, I'm very happy to elaborate on all of the other situations, but at the Q&A session only. So let's see the first, let's say, case study that we have, and that's the role of women in peace operation. And why I'm trying to frame it in a very deliberate way is that it's not just protecting women during armed conflicts, but the UN is thinking about it in different terms. Because women can be, for example, peacekeepers. This is something that the UN has been promoting throughout its entire history, that women are not just the underdogs, not just those who should be protected, but they should actively take part in the cessation of hostilities. They should be peacekeepers themselves, because as we're going to see shortly, it has a lot of added benefit to have women as peacekeepers in that armed conflict. Secondly, women can also be protected persons, because let's face it, some of the sexual violence, for example, that happens is mostly going to target women. So the traditional category of women as people who are suffering the war, the results, the aftermath of the war, are still present and prevalent. And of course, peace builders. And this is a relatively new concept that emerged in roughly the late 1980s, early 1990s, in which studies have shown that if you have women who are at the negotiating table, who are responsible for working out a compromise, then those political compromises at the end of the conflict, when the ceasefire agreements, when the peace treaties are being formulated, this will result in a more lasting peace. But more on this shortly. These three dimensions will be touched upon very quickly. Yeah. So first of all, women as peacekeepers. We're going to see drastically different trends regarding on which type of peacekeeper we're talking about. If we're talking about civilians, so women as civilian peacekeepers, we can see some very good numbers. We have almost reached gender parity in this regard. The UN is consciously trying to promote women in peace operations. However, with regards to police and especially military, the numbers can be much lower. Why is this? Because, to put it very simply, there aren't enough women in the police and military forces of the countries who are contributing peacekeepers. It's not hard to see that if you don't have female peacekeepers domestically, then you cannot really send female peacekeepers. So first of all, and this is what I try to emphasize always, meaningful change starts at home. The UN can be a catalyst of the change, but it is not able to make these decisions instead of the countries. So countries, if they are promoting, for example, women in their own armed forces, then that's a very good first step, because then those women can be sent to a police or military operation. As you can see from some of the legal sources, the UN has been trying to promote it through the Beijing Declaration of 1995, when it was agreed that we should increase the number of women in peacekeeping, all the way to the Women, Peace and Security Agenda of 2000. Now, it's not an encouraging thing that since 2000, the UN and its subsequent Security Council resolutions year after year, again and again, had to emphasize that women need to take a much more active role in peace operations, which means that it is still not there. We still haven't reached that sufficient amount of women's participation. You can see the target goals. Around 2020, we had around 18.4% as military observers and staff officers, but regarding military contingents, we only had 4.8%. That's very low, because the goal would be, of course, 50%. So the UN's target is to reach 15% by 2028, so within 4 short years. I'm very skeptical whether we can actually reach this goal, but at least this is something to strive towards, akin to the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, why is the UN promoting this idea? Is it because of just some Western ideas of gender parity and gender equality? Not really. Because what the UN has realized through case studies, through empirical research, and through a very hands-on approach, is that if you have women involved in peace operations, that can result in rebuilding social cohesion. Because when you are dealing with domestic problems and you have peacekeepers there who are trying to solve those domestic problems, then women can understand the suffering of both parties, not just listening to the male component of the civilian population, but also listening to the plight of children and women. Maybe some different questions they will ask. For example, how can you ensure that those kids reach school? How can you ensure that, for example, you have adequate water in the house? Because if the male part of the population goes on to wage wars or work in agriculture or work in industry or so on, it will still be the women's role to look for water, to carry the kids, to make sure that the house is being kept. And there are lots of hazards in a war-torn environment that could hamper this process. And of course, if the local population feels that their voice is being heard, then there's going to be a creation of trust towards the UN and towards the whole peacekeeping effort in its first place. And last but not least, of course, women can provide deterrence, meaning that if you have cases of domestic violence, for example, it will be much easier for the women to turn to police officers who are also women. And this is quite interesting because irrespective of the different language that they might speak, different cultural background, different religion, different skin color whatsoever, still, if you can talk to a female police officer, then you are much more likely, on the one hand, to be heard, And on the other hand, you're much more open with what has happened to you, so the chances of re-traumatization are going to be much lower. So these are some of the facts that the UN has felt in its work. And then, of course, we have some very positive and encouraging examples of, for instance, female leadership in peace operations. For example, we have the first female force commander in a UN peace operation by General Kristin Lund of Norway, who is leading the Middle Eastern peace operation, so not the most safe and secure place in the world right now. And of course, some countries, most notably India, for instance, have been using the so-called FFPUs, the fully female-formed police units, meaning roughly 100-150 female police officers who are being deployed to certain countries. For India, for example, that was Liberia, in which this country has at least a decade of very good and beneficial experience in how female police officers can be used on the ground. And of course, this example has been followed by several other countries such as Nigeria, Brazil, and some others. But by some others, I only mean a handful. So this is not a mass tendency of countries sending fully female-formed police units. These are just some countries which have taken initiatives because they also have a sufficient number of female police units available, and those female police officers are also willing to go abroad. So you can't really forcefully send them. Why is it good to have female police officers specifically on the ground? Well, we have lots of very good reasons to underpin this statement. For example, they can provide security, patrols, just switching on light bulbs in the middle of the street, making sure that they are patrolling those dark alleyways where predators might lurk. Or they can be the ones who are making sure that water fountains, water accessibility, for example, schools are being regarded as safe places and not, let's say, possible ambush routes where women can be attacked and targeted. The female police officers were used to teach self-defense, to teach first aid techniques, to teach about sexually transmitted diseases. So they have considerably improved the knowledge and skills of the local population. And furthermore, they have been serving as role models, as encouraging examples that your only choice is not just to be a housewife. You can choose it if you want to, so there's nothing wrong with it. But there are other options as well, and the fact that there's not just one option of getting married, but you can also, besides getting married, you can also have a career on your own, for example, as law enforcement. Because it's one thing to tell tales about how women can choose, but it's a completely different thing to see that there are actually female police officers in the flesh, and they are going abroad and they're gathering experience. Besides, they can have families at home if they choose to do so. So this has been a very beneficial experiment, and I'm very sad to say that this has been an experiment, because these operations, or some of these operations that have been ongoing, for example, Liberia and Haiti, have closed down. And we don't see too much of a follow-up in this regard. We don't see a continuation of these efforts lately, although the UN is heavily promoting these ideas. Moving on to the third aspect of women as peace builders and what they can bring to the table, it's an old saying that there are men who are fighting the war and there are women who have to endure, which means that if the men are away, then the women will have to take care of the household all on their own. They have to maintain the life of the family, care for the children, and so on. So additional burdens are being borne by women, especially if the men will not return from that armed conflict, if they will die there. So, as seen by the UN, if we have in that armed conflict, whether it be international or non-international in nature, if we have women in leadership positions as head of the rebel groups, of guerrillas, of different militant movements, then the chances for a lasting peace is going to be improved dramatically. To put it in numbers again, we're going to see that there's a 35% better chance for that peace agreement to last if women have also been involved at that negotiating table. If their opinions were asked for and they were heard, and some of the recommendations were incorporated into that peace agreement, into that truce or ceasefire. Why is it? Because women are much more closer to civil society. They will hear a lot of voices. They will know the plight of some unheard groups. For example, people with disabilities. Who's caring for them most of the time? It's going to be women who will be there in hospitals and in homes taking care of the elderly, of the sick. So they would have a much more global view of the conflict and its ramifications and what a lasting peace can bring to the table. So these are some of the ideas that we can see regarding women's participation in those peace operations. The other thing which I wanted to show you is the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, because it was, let's say, a presupposition by some scholars of both international law and international relations that if there were a major international crisis, then maybe the countries in the world, states all over, would cooperate more. They would realize that there is an interdependency, that we need one another to survive this ongoing crisis. And the COVID pandemic was a true crisis. Millions of people have died worldwide. We still do not know the exact numbers, but it's at least in the tens of millions. So a global pandemic, I think all of you can remember those years. It wasn't that long ago when mandatory social distancing, mask wearing, and all these regulations were imposed on us. However, what did it mean for peace operations? Did it cool armed conflicts? Not really, because there was civil war in Ethiopia, there was social unrest in Hong Kong and in Belarus, new conflicts came about, the Syrian civil war hasn't solidified, and by the end of COVID, Russia and Ukraine were in an armed conflict. So the previous assessment is that a global crisis would stop existing hostilities and prevent new ones. Didn't really come to pass. The second assessment was that states would cooperate during such a pandemic. And to a certain degree this was true, because from a health science perspective, the World Health Organization, working with several NGOs, has been very successful in developing the vaccine. So pooling the knowledge, pooling the resources was unheard of under previous conflicts, but here during the times of the COVID pandemic, this has happened. 157 states have cooperated in making sure that the vaccines are being developed sufficiently fast. So that was a major achievement. However, when it came to the distribution of those vaccines, suddenly we see a shift in a country's attitudes, because most countries said that our people come first and foremost. So they have been stacking and stocking up vaccines, oftentimes 2 or 3 or even 4 times the size of the population of those countries, and they were refusing to share it. For example, I just heard back in 2021 that one country in Europe, I will not name it, is sending 6,000 vaccines to Bangladesh. It's very nice, but it's a country of around 280 million people. So sending 6,000 is very nice, but it's not really enough. So hoarding millions of vaccines and then sending a few thousand just before they were to expire is not exactly such a major act of altruism. However, the funding for these organizations has dramatically improved, which has also led to the funding of other research. For example, just last year it was announced that the World Health Organization has managed to test a vaccine for malaria at a very cheap cost of roughly $2 per jab, which is a major step for a lot of countries in Africa. So this has some added positive value as well. How did it affect peacekeepers? Well, the tasks of peacekeepers has multiplied, because during that health crisis, it's already very hard to obtain the trust of the population. But if you're wearing a mask and gloves, that doesn't really help with people believing you, trusting you, because they can't see your face. They only see that you are coming at them with a syringe, with a huge needle, and you're trying to inject something to them. So it doesn't really build trust. Furthermore, some of the governments in peace operations, such as in Mali, South Sudan, or the Central African Republic, have been highly skeptical, because peacekeepers come from all over the place. What's the best way to make sure that you are infected? To meet with people from all over the place. So they have been skeptical that peacekeepers could bring a lot of disease and infection with them. So they were quarantined first and foremost for 3 weeks, and only after that could they resume their functions, of course leading to less of a chance for peacekeepers to be actively engaging the civilian population on the ground. So this was a much more strenuous environment for peacekeepers. Peacekeepers have been a little bit afraid of what is to come in those situations. However, the protection of the civilian population was also much harder, because people have closed their doors, people have been a bit more, let's say, restrained. However, it's also a somewhat positive thing that in a lot of countries, especially in the African continent, the COVID pandemic was not as serious as in other countries. Why? First of all, because in those countries the median age of the population is much lower. So COVID, of course, had a very detrimental effect on the already sick and those with some pre-existing conditions. If you have a younger, more healthy, robust population, then the chances that they will get infected or infected with a lethal outcome is going to be lower. Secondly, these are small communities that are relatively isolated from one another, often not trading for weeks, so there was a little chance for that disease to be transmitted. So overall, this was a mixed picture when it comes to peacekeeping and the right to a healthy environment. Where it was very threatening was in prisons, where the inmates, of course, had to live in close proximity. Hygienic conditions were not exactly met, which has meant that the disease could spread quite far and wide on those areas. And of course, if you are seeing a situation in the Central African Republic, let's say, data collection is not a priority. So they do not have it as their utmost interest to get all of those cases of who died because of what reasons. They already have civil wars, they have a huge volume of armed conflict in that area, so they are not exactly keen on taking statistics as efficiently as in other countries. So what conclusions can we draw? Global cooperation was on the one hand existing, on the other hand it wasn't it hasn't fully manifested itself as it was expected. However, it has led to modernizing a lot of healthcare traditions and customs, basic hygienic concepts, the thought that wearing a mask is not something that only China, Japan, and South Korea does, but it's something that can be used widely, and it has benefits, has spread in those areas, to a certain degree, of course. However, this has also meant that in the year of, let's say, 2020, there was also a limited chance for peacekeepers to engage in misconduct. This has not been the case later down the line, as we can see from statistics in 2021 and 2022, so the two latter waves or stages of the COVID pandemic, that it didn't really stop sexual crimes by peacekeepers from occurring. And I think time is running out very rapidly, so I would just like to highlight one more thing, and then we can return to any of these issues that interest you in the Q&A session, and that is how sexual exploitation and abuse can be observed. Now, if and when peacekeepers commit crimes of sexual nature, that's obviously not a good thing, because the UN is trying to prevent crimes of sexual nature from happening. There's a widespread consensus that this should be prevented, and if it still happens, then something should be done to punish the perpetrators and to make sure that countries are also taking steps to investigate and to remedy these acts by their judicial tools. However, this is sometimes very hard to implement under a set of conditions. Since time is running out, I would just like to highlight two things. The first one is that the UN has taken very significant measures in addressing sexual exploitation and abuse. When the current Secretary General Antonio Guterres was elected to head the organization in 2017, it was one of his main goals to make sure that sexual exploitation and abuse are going to be eradicated. And for this, he has come up with a lot of very, let's say, good sounding initiatives, very promising initiatives, and some of them have resulted in a major improvement, whereas others were not so universally acclaimed. For example, what went really well are some of the best practices that were shared. For instance, Bangladesh and Egypt have come up with some rapid investigation mechanisms. They have voluntarily pledged that if they contact any allegation of sexual exploitation and abuse, they will take action within 5 to 10 days. And that's a major improvement, because now if there is a case, then these countries will send their own investigators to gather evidence, victims' testimonials, and so on in a very short period of time. And that's very laudable. However, these are 2 countries out of 193. So some of these best practices are good, but again, they are not very widespread. The other one that was quite successful is the so-called voluntary DNA database. Because one of the hardships that women faced is that if they were victims to sexual exploitation and abuse, or if they had children as a result of a liaison with a peacekeeper, then after 6 months that peacekeeper left. Meanwhile, the child was born and there was no one to look after them. So no one to pay alimony, no one to support them, and of course you cannot say that, I know that this guy is the father. How can you prove it? Especially in such an environment where you don't have, let's say, written documentation of something, you might not even have pictures or anything, and you cannot charge someone and gather DNA from them stating that he must be the father. That would be outrageous. So what some countries, for example Sri Lanka, Argentina, have come up with is to have a so-called DNA bank. Basically, before deployment, they take a blood sample from all peacekeepers, so that if there's an allegation, then they can immediately check the DNA that was gathered on the spot with the DNA of the peacekeeper to see if there's a match. Simple, elegant, voluntary. So if you want to go to a peace operation, you have to do it, which is semi-voluntary at least, but it's effective. However, only a handful of states have adopted this voluntary thing because it's a lot of fuss. You have to have the technology available, you have to make sure that the DNA is stored, and of course if you're sending thousands of peacekeepers, it can be a chore, it can be an additional task, and states like to avoid having additional burdens on them. However, what wasn't really successful is, for example, the so-called circle of leadership attempt by the UN. Because this has meant that the UN, and the idea was quite solid, because they had the idea that let's invite, let's say, former and current heads of state and heads of government to lend their weight and influence and diplomatic potential behind this initiative. So let's use them to pressure countries into making sure that the perpetrators are punished. Sounds very good on paper, right? Well, it was established in 2018. Now it's 2024. This circle of leadership met twice in New York. They had a champagne toast, they clapped one another on the shoulder saying, good job, let's focus on this in the future. Any tangible results? Not really. And of course, if you invite leaders like former President Trump or Vladimir Putin, who are not exactly major proponents of human rights and specifically women's rights, then the results are not exactly guaranteed to be astounding. Also, they have promoted a so-called voluntary compact with states, which is supposed to be an international document, and I'm deliberately vague here, which means that states are promising and pledging to cooperate in case they encounter sexual exploitation and abuse. They promise to take steps to combat this phenomenon. You are studying law here. What does it tell you? If states promise something in a document, not a treaty, a document, it's nothing. It's a declaration of intent, something that cannot be enforced before courts, something that cannot be put to practice. So this sounds very good on paper. This is supposed to remind states of their obligations, but this is not something that can be used in practice. No state can be brought before the International Court of Justice stating that you have violated these norms, because this is just a declaration, a political document essentially, and not a legal one. Also, a trust fund for victims was established, which was also very nice. However, there are only certain operations in which that trust fund could operate. So there were a lot of peace operations, for example, in South Sudan, where the trust fund has not yet begun its work, even though there has been a significant number of victims from those areas as well. So it's a bit partial to where it was possible to establish the trust fund itself. And of course, we have the victims' rights advocate, who is supposed to channel the grievances, the pain, all the issues that the victims suffer, and voice it as a single, educated, well-formulated opinion to the UN and to the international community. Now, the problem was that although the voices were heard, the victims' rights advocate herself has not visited these operations herself. So she relied on second-hand reports and basically just read documents and then forwarded. Now, bear in mind, I also haven't visited any of these peace operations, so I'm also gathering my second-hand information. However, it is worth noting that if you are a victims' rights advocate, then your job would be to go to the victims and meet them face to face, so that you have a first-hand impression of what has happened to them. And this, for quite a few years, did not happen. So, as you can see, there are lots of very good initiatives. Some of them have borne fruit, but some of them have not. So, from the point of view of the UN, much more needs to be done to combat sexual exploitation and abuse. And the last thing which I wanted to show you is that this unfortunately seemingly follows a cycle. Because if there is a large number of these crimes happening, then the media will get word of it. And there's going to be a major scandal featured in every newspaper, every online website, and so on. And so the UN will be forced to act. They will nominate a special rapporteur who is a neutral, independent, impartial observer who will have a fantastic set of recommendations on how to improve the system. And from that moment on, the UN is realizing that this is good. However, due to financial constraints, due to diplomatic hardships, it will implement only a few of them into the policy of the organization. And when the policy is being transferred into practice, it's only a smaller, an even smaller fraction of it that gets implemented, which means that this phenomenon is unfortunately staying with us for the years to come, until there's a new scandal, and then the cycle begins anew. So this is quite unfortunate, but just to close on a positive note, we have some very good examples regarding peacekeeping, and specifically regarding the rights of women. The female police officers and their presence has brought meaningful change to a lot of peace operations. We have the paternity tests that are being used right now. We have the trust fund, and it works in some of these operations. We have right now a whistleblower protection regime that was introduced in 2016, so that if you have an information from inside the organization, you don't have to fear being fired, as the gentleman in the bottom left screen, Mr. Andras of Sweden, who worked for the Human Rights Commissioner, and when he voiced his concerns that these issues are not addressed, what happened was not that these were investigated, but he was fired for leaking information to the press. And of course, the rapid investigation mechanism is also helping quite a lot, used by some countries only. Just one key takeaway from it is that peacekeepers are not the enemy. They are the ones coming from 193 different countries who are voluntarily being sent to those countries, those areas in the world in which no other party would help. Just the UN and only peacekeepers. There is no alternative right now to peacekeeping. There are other ways how peacekeeping can be replaced by, for example, regional organizations such as the African Union or certain willing countries such as Kenya. But in most cases, there is no chance to replace these institutions. So we shouldn't abolish peacekeeping, but we should support it and reform it to make sure that it is protecting human rights as it should under the UN Charter and under the resolutions of the UN Security Council. Thank you very much for being here and for listening. And if you have any questions, now is the time to ask.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for the lecture. It was very enlightening. I'm a first year student from VMSCL, and my questions are pertaining to when you were talking about the places where peacekeeping is not being taken place. And you mentioned Afghanistan and some other countries as well. So I just wanted your thoughts on this, because Afghanistan, Iran, and certain of those states are actually suffering from a chaos that is a remnant of the bipolar war between US and Russia. So I feel like even if peacekeepers are there on the foot of whichever states needed, I think they need to be, like this is my personal opinion, I could be roughly correct, that they need to be from a state which has no ulterior agenda or national interest in that particular state. Because if it is done from some kind of ulterior motive, then you will never know whether it's objective, like they are doing it for the right reasons. Another question that I have, which is straying away from the topic of peacekeeping, is the right to privacy, which is obviously it won't be necessary in these because they are going through much more turbulent times. But in our times where all the states are becoming surveillance states, in order as an just so that they can preempt any kind of major disaster or attacks, like how do we protect our right to privacy with that degradation?
Can you elaborate on the last part of the question?
The right to privacy?
Yes.
So I was reading a book by Edward Snowden where he mentioned how US was collecting a lot of information from their own citizens, and also they got intel across the states where no matter what your information is, they are collecting it. And that is a need for all the states to be a surveillance state in order to be a preemptive institution so that they can prevent some major disasters by either separatist or anarchist groups. And that also hampers our right to privacy because they need that surveillance state. And I know that it's a very difficult dilemma to actually answer on, but I just wanted to know your thoughts on it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Since this was at least 3 questions, and I would be happy to answer these 3 before we are moving on. So the first one is about Afghanistan, Iran, and in some countries in which the country is a bit shaky. So they would require, or let's say, we would have the feeling that they might require some international help, but there is no international help. Why isn't there? Because these states have not asked for international help. Afghanistan has asked for financial help in making sure that international supplies, for example, especially in the form of money, are being delivered to Afghanistan, but they do not want to have peacekeepers and they do not want to have international personnel. And based on the history of the country, where you had foreign interventions in the country, that's somewhat understandable. However, states will not say that we are providing financial help, but we know that the Taliban will take that money and maybe use it for example, terrorist activities. So they are very reluctant to send financial supplies. The other reason that, for example, in Iran, you will not see a peace operation is because, to a certain degree, it also undermines the legitimacy of the government. Because then the government cannot say that we are the government, we are in control of the country. If they are requesting international personnel to help with the maintenance of peace and security and to provide services to the citizens. So admitting that you need international help and international personnel would also mean that the country is not in charge anymore, that the government is not in charge of the country anymore, that they need some foreign aid. And that blows the wind in the sail of the opposition in most cases, so they are very reluctant to do so. Those countries that have requested international help, for example, Haiti in the Caribbean, there the situation was that there was one gang leader who called upon the president to resign, and he did. Can you imagine the situation? You have armed gangs, and then just one guy with a gun goes on camera and says, you should resign, and he does. So that means that the country is in a very bad position where the government is actually not capable of doing anything. Then they will ask for help. Of course, from a legal point of view, if you are in a government who doesn't exercise control over the country, do you have legitimacy to ask for international intervention? It's debatable, at least. So that's regarding the first question. Your second one was regarding participation, who should participate in these peace operations. To highlight this with a very easy example, you have a peace operation that has existed between India and Pakistan, UNMOJIP, for over 70 years. Everyone can participate in that operation, except if you're a citizen of India or Pakistan. Why? Because of the obvious bias. And to make sure that the operation is regarded as unbiased, they're also moving the seat of the operation every 6 months from Pakistan to India and back. So they're making sure that those who are actually involved in that conflict cannot be peacekeepers. Why not? Because if you are interested in the outcome of that conflict, and that's leaning towards one party, then you are affiliated with that party. If you're affiliated with that party, then the whole peace operation cannot be regarded as an independent and neutral thing. So if you're not regarded as independent and neutral, what's the next step? The others will say that you are biased, or they might shoot at you at the end, to put it short. And the third question was about the right to privacy. And we are happy to teach, in most cases, that human rights should be understood as a whole. There is no hierarchy. However, there is some sort of hierarchy when there are human rights, such as the right to life is at risk. So if there's a flood, for example, because this is the monsoon season, and you have to take people away from safety, it's not a major issue to gather their personal data or their fingerprints or where they live and to store that information to make sure that they are being kept safely. What happens to that data afterwards is the interesting thing, whether or how you obtain that data, voluntarily or involuntarily. Will the individual know how that data was collected and used for what purposes and deleted after a set amount of time? And also, of course, my computer science friends tell me that once the data is gathered, it cannot really be deleted. So there's going to be some imprint somewhere that is, if you are very skilled at your job, it can be retracted further down the line. So just on a side note, be wary of what you post on the internet, because it will stay there forever, even if you delete it. So the right to privacy is important, but it's not that important as, for example, saving lives during an armed conflict. So there is some sort of hierarchy, but don't quote me on it, because officially there is none.
Any other question?
Hi, my name is Joseph Andras, and I'm from SYLB. My question here is basically in terms of the UN through the WHO has taken part in various endeavors to reach out to various parts of the world in terms of medical assistance and stuff. What I see here is, since the 1980s or even before that, maybe HIV or AIDS has been a menace for all of the world, and it's only progressing. So my question was, what are the efforts in terms of investment in medical research or endeavors to curb this menace called HIV or AIDS in terms of not only vaccines or maybe medications which would, for once and for all kind of, put an end to this menace. AIDS is one of them. There are many other sicknesses like maybe cancer or maybe tumors and stuff like that. So what is the kind of intervention or what is the kind of investment, whether it's financially or whether it's in terms of research and development? Thank you.
It's also a fairly complicated question, but an excellent one, because the UN is, of course, sponsoring all kinds of research. So it is working together with a lot of research centers, but its efforts will be different regarding on the individual disease or infection or negative health hazard that we're talking about. For example, it is promoting a healthy lifestyle, not using alcohol, tobacco, eating fatty foods, and so on. So for that, they have awareness-raising campaigns. For cancer, for example, the UN has recognized that cancer, or let's say finding the cure for cancer, is in the interest of basically all of the biomedical companies in the world. So it is not emphasizing research on cancer, because there are already hundreds and thousands of entities, organizations, private companies who are spending billions of dollars on finding the cure for cancer, because if you're the first one to find it, then you will be extremely rich. However, there are some major instances where the World Health Organization has been very successful. And one of those success stories is tied here to India, because the smallpox that was ravaging India in the 1950s, 1960s was eradicated, and this was the place where this was eradicated by the 1970s. And the World Health Organization, for example, has had a campaign. Back then, there were around 100 million Indian households. And the World Health Organization launched an effort with several NGOs together, and they went over the course of 10 years to each Indian household 4 times and make sure that everyone gets the jab 4 times. And that has meant the eradication of an illness that has caused the lives of hundreds of millions of people throughout human history. So there are success stories. However, when the World Health Organization was handling the Ebola crisis in Western Africa in 2015, there it was slow to act. It didn't categorize the situation as a pandemic early on. It didn't pressure states in enforcing quarantine rules. So there have been some mixed results in that regard. And of course, as we have seen with the COVID pandemic, there have been also mixed results. These can be tied also to the support of the organization and to the amount of money that it has. Now, nominally, it has as large of a budget as the entire UN, and it's just one specialized agency. However, if you think about it, a few $1 billion in budget, and you are supposed to treat everyone's illnesses around the world, then it's not exactly enough. So from a budgetary point of view, that's also somewhat problematic. The example that you mentioned was that of AIDS. However, AIDS is also a very conflicting one because it is still very prevalent in lots of parts of the world, but specifically in Africa. However, in Africa, the World Health Organization has met a resistance movement also towards making sure that AIDS is combated sufficiently. And by this I mean several religious organizations, churches. For example, both Christian and Muslim churches were against, for example, any contraception that could be used. And of course, one of the easiest way to fight HIV/AIDS is by using, for example, condoms. If you are promoting that condoms will lead you to hell and they will curse your soul for eternity, then that doesn't really help the World Health Organization's efforts. So there were some unexpected setbacks. If this wouldn't be the case, then it's very likely that HIV/AIDS, I wouldn't say eradicated, but it would have been reduced by quite a lot. And of course, just one more thing to this is that these organizations, both the UN and the World Health Organization, is running on money from states, voluntary contributions, donations also. And more specifically, around 20% of their budget comes from the US, which means that in the era of, for example, Donald Trump, they reduced the amount that they are paying to the World Health Organization by half, meaning that some vaccination programs, some joint research initiatives had to be shut down, which has meant that although there were some illnesses that would have been almost eliminated, we have eliminated 99%, suddenly the vaccination program stopped because there wasn't enough funding and it began to spread all over again. And of course, if we don't reach a sufficient number of vaccinations, then it can pop up again and again. So, yeah. Do you have a follow-up? Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So, the follow-up question is that, the further that we've seen in terms of developing a vaccine for COVID, because COVID vaccines were developed within a matter of maybe 6-7 months or so, and indicating to that further in terms of developing some sort of vaccines or some sort of medical provisions in terms of AIDS or HIV. Having understood the fact that contraceptives is an essential element to prevent it, but let's face the reality that most people may either be ignorant or may not or may want to take the risk of having contracted AIDS or HIV virus for that matter. So the fervor is what I'm talking about in terms of the fervor that we saw with regard to the COVID vaccines. Is there any similar fervor that we see in terms of the WHO trying to develop vaccines in this regard?
You mean regarding COVID or regarding others?
Regarding HIV.
Regarding HIV.
Because it's been like 40 years now that we've heard about it and stuff like that, and we've developed some mechanism in terms of contraceptives and stuff, but the problem still persists. So that's what I think was talking in terms of the fervor. Because if we could do it for COVID in 6-7 months or maybe a year, we can surely do something for HIV/AIDS. That's my follow-up.
That's a fair point, but you still have to consider that states are not exactly interested in the same manner in treating HIV/AIDS as they were in addressing COVID, because COVID was a universal killer. It has targeted anyone irrespective of the level of development of the country, of the color of your skin or your religion. For HIV/AIDS, there are still some governments who will say that this is reserved for a few countries and for a few groups, especially some groups that have a different sexual orientation. So they might not be interested in developing a cure. Now, I'm not a human biologist, so I will not know whether it is actually possible or not due to our current understanding. But drawing from the example of malaria, that was still regarded as something for which there cannot be any sort and form of vaccination. So when you visited a country in which malaria was rampant, you had to take the pills before, during, and after your trip. But it seemed that research has reached a breakthrough, and now it is possible. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility of having an HIV/AIDS vaccine, but for that you would have to talk to an immunologist or a human biologist who knows much more about how these diseases are spread. I'm looking at it from an international organization's point of view, strictly speaking.
Any other questions?
So I'm Arvind, and I want to ask you about the private military companies. They take part in the UN operations. As they have no nationality, how can you punish them for the crimes they have committed or human rights violations? Thank you.
So for this one, if you are a peacekeeper, if you are engaged in any kind of activity, then the core rule of thumb is that you cannot be prosecuted and punished by the country where you are serving. So if you are employed by a private military and security companies, that's a different story. That's sort of a gray area in international law, because theoretically you are not a combatant. You cannot really take part in the hostilities. You are just security personnel employed by the UN. Now this would mean that if you are committing a crime, then in the practice of the UN, you are being repatriated, meaning sent home to the country of nationality. All of the information that the UN can gather about your conduct and allegedly misconduct will be handed over to the country of your origin, the country of your citizenship, and then that country will decide, it's going to be the discretional decision of that country whether to prosecute you or not. However, there's another way to do it, because if you are, for example, a civilian employee, and since private military and security companies are bordering on being either military or civilian in nature, because if you're military, then you might be regarded as a mercenary, and of course mercenaries are outlawed. But if you're a civilian, what can happen is the UN issues something called a waiver. So they will waive your immunity, allowing the host state to exercise its criminal jurisdiction in your case. In some cases this has been done, but very rarely. And often the shift of those private military and security council employees will be over before the whole waiver process goes through with the UN. There have been attempts by the current Secretary General Antonio Guterres to shorten this waiver procedure and to make sure that in very serious cases that are of high importance for the host state, these waivers can be issued quite quickly. But you always have to remember that the protection and the immunity regime for peacekeepers was put in place for the reason to protect them for any undue procedure. And if you are having a peace operation, that means that the country is already in a very bad situation in which one of the most fragile systems is the justice system. So they might not have fair trial standards, sufficient judicial guarantees. If that's the case, then the UN will not issue that waiver and instead relying on the contributing country to have the criminal procedure against you.
Good day, Doctor. That was an insightful lecture. Let me ask a number of questions. The first one is, how important is the role of consent in the peacekeeping operations? And are there any exceptions to the the concept of consent? Is there any examples where consent was disregarded? The second question is, when you talk about positive aspects of peacekeeping, one of them is elections and how peacekeepers play a very important role. So if we take a hypothetical situation, there are certain states where elections, there's some process like transitional government in Bangladesh, or situations where elections are not seen as fair outside, for example, Kagame's Rwanda. So should peacekeeping forces play a more important role in these places? Of course, affecting sovereignty, but nevertheless, should they play an important role? Last question is, should we relook the way peacekeeping operations have operated? Is there a need to stop some of them, especially in Western Sahara, the referendum? Definitely India, Pakistan, it's been quite a number of years that they are here. Should the whole process be relooked right now? Thank you.
Again, an excellent set of questions, where the first one was about the role of consent. Now, consent is one of the three core principles of peace operations, the other two being impartiality and neutrality, and the limited use of force in those peace operations. So I would say that consent, out of these three, consent is going to be the most important. So that lies at the heart, at the core of peace operations. In situations in which consent was not given, for example Somalia, in which the central government gave consent, but the central government only controlled around 10% of the country's territory. And the other parties did not really give consent, nor were they consulted, to be honest. In those cases, the lack of consent can lead to attacks on the peacekeepers themselves. So their safety and security cannot be guaranteed without consent. And of course, it did happen that the country, after a set amount of time, felt that it is now sufficiently stable and secure, so they have asked the UN to leave. That's the end of the consent, which signifies that the peace operation should be ended. Now, all peace operations are set up for around 6 months or a 1-year lifespan, which seem very short. However, this enables the Security Council to revisit the issue every half a year, every year, and to prolong the mandate. And then they will analyze, is there a need for this operation anymore? Do we still have the consent of all the major parties involved? Because there might be new political parties, new militant movements, new secessionist local forces that are in play. Do we still have the consent of all forces? Do we need to improve the amount or increase the amount of forces or reduce the amount of forces? And then they can renew the mandate and maybe tailor it towards suiting the times that have changed since then. So yes, I would say that the role of consent is of primary importance. If there is no consent and the UN still wishes to go, then we are no longer calling it a peacekeeping operation, we're calling it peace enforcement. And in some cases that can have very detrimental effects, as Somalia is a key example for it. Your second question was about elections and what role peacekeepers can play. And for this, peacekeepers can play a very varied role, depending on the needs of the country. So if the country needs peacekeepers to observe as an independent, neutral third party, then they will observe. If they require peacekeepers to also help with organizing it, establishing districts, making sure that there is no violence or politically motivated action during those elections, then the peacekeepers can do that. The bottom line here is that peacekeepers are not saying that we are enforcing the election results. They are not an election committee that can verify that these have been fair and legitimate elections. They can voice their opinions afterwards, but they cannot really influence it if the country does not wish them to influence these elections. And last but not least, the question was about the end of the operations and then how do we know that it's time to revisit, for example, existing peace operations. Well, first and foremost, it's the question of consent. Do we still have the consent of those parties? In the case of India and Pakistan, for example, that operation was supposed to be also an observer operation to observe the plebiscite in Jammu and Kashmir to decide to which country that would belong to. That never happened, so the peacekeepers have stayed. Do we still have the consent? Yes, both Pakistan and India still continue to maintain that peace operation. So the UN is not forcibly here. The UN has asked for permission and both states said that it's a good idea. What would happen if they would leave? We don't know. We're not prophets, not oracles and soothsayers to know what is going to happen. But to put it simply, these are two very large countries, each having their own nuclear arsenal. So it's worth it to maintain a peace operation with just 100 people in that very volatile region, physically separating India and Pakistan, because if those forces were to leave suddenly, then there might be a risk that one of the sides would decide to invade the territory of the other. Furthermore, if right now this would be the case and you would want to go through the peacekeepers, that would mean around 50 to 20 countries' personnel. So the international community would be immediately against the attacker for also attacking their, let's say, small amount of forces that have been stationed there. So it's a very good and, let's say, cost-effective way of making sure that this is safe and secure. However, you cannot expect 120 people who are basically unarmed, just sitting across the border and seeing what is happening to resolve the decades-long strife between India and Pakistan. They are not here for that, and they are not capable of doing that, nor should it be expected of them. Yeah.
Any last questions?
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
So this was an interesting eye-opener to the consent and the enforcement by the UN peacekeeping forces. Just wanted to know on what basis can you enforce the UN peacekeeping missions in certain countries which do not give you the consent to enter?
Well, there is a very simple answer to it, is that you cannot enforce it. So first of all, the UN will have to see whether the country in question asks for help, or the UN can offer that help, but if those two directions do not meet, then there will be no peace operations. So the UN cannot say that, I see that the situation is very bad on the ground, do you accept, do you consent to us sending forces? If the state says no, there is nothing to do. The UN, for example, has for years been trying to deliver humanitarian supplies to Syria. Not a peace operation, just bringing supplies to the population because they have been fleeing by the millions and dying by the tens of thousands. And the Syrian government said no.
So the UN peacekeeping missions authorities do not have any authority to enter with force any
No.
country with
No. If you want to enter with force into a country, that's not peacekeeping, that's either peace enforcement or coercive action. Now, a similarity is that both are done under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. However, for a UN peace operation, being under Chapter 7 of the Charter doesn't mean that you can force compliance with the peace operation. It means that you have to recognize the existence of the operation, and it creates a solid legal basis for that operation. For a coercive action, on the other hand, this will mean that so that's sometimes interpreted as a sanction, a military sanction. Then that will mean that the country has done something so horribly wrong that upsets international peace and security. It's a direct threat to the maintenance of international peace and security, so we're going to change it. So a prime example for this can be, for example, the 2011 air blockade over Libya. Because there, the government of Libya, the Gaddafi regime, was using the airspace to bomb their own citizens. And the UN said, you shouldn't bomb your own citizens. That's a threat to international peace and security. So they have sent British and French troops, supported by the US, to make sure that Libyan Air Force does not even use its own airspace because they have been killing the population from above. That's a coercive action. There, they did not ask for Libya to provide permission because they were the ones who have been violating international law. You are welcome. Thank you very much for the excellent questions. I do wish that you keep up an open mind towards international affairs and more specifically international law. And I do hope to continue this discussion with you further down the line. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I can most
Excellent round of
certainly say
questions.
that Sir's words have really made us understand this topic. We entered here today with little knowledge about this topic, and we're definitely going to live with a lot more knowledge. So thank you, sir, for such an enlightening and thought-provoking session. Gratitude is not just a courtesy. It's a recognition of the impact someone has had on our part, just like Sir today. And to express our gratitude, I would now like to call upon Shraddha Yadav from second year BALB, who has painted a beautiful art piece to be presented to Dr. András Hárs as a small token of appreciation and a memory from Goa.
Thank you very much. You are the one who painted it?
Yes.
You with your own hand?
Yes.
Oh, it's very nice. Thank you. I will treasure it greatly.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
To bring our session to a close, I would now like to invite Professor Ramrai Naik, Director of Centre for Political Leadership, to provide our concluding remarks and extend our appreciation to all who are involved in making the session a success.
Okay. That was very nice.
Good afternoon.
It's very beautiful.
Usually for our CPL or beyond the syllabus initiatives, we often keep vote of thanks before. But because of the significance of this event, we thought of keeping it last. I have a lot of people to thank, so please bear with me. I don't intend to infringe upon your human rights and the tea that is waiting for you. When Shraddha painted that beautiful painting yesterday, she completed it half a day. And the next day when she got it yesterday and she asked whether she should spend more time to improve upon it. I said it's already a great work, but I was thinking in my mind, how can you please someone who almost wakes up to a beautiful scenery outside in Budapest. The entire city of Budapest and the country Hungary is like a work of art when you see that. And I was seeing Expedia videos yesterday. On a serious note, when I looked at the university, and there were many courses that are offered that can be beneficial to a lot of our students. And also when I saw the picture outside, it was almost like the Grand Budapest Hotel of the university. They were almost looking similar. So I would encourage all of you to look at the university, access, see some courses. But at the outset, the information that was shared, so many insights that I think will be beneficial for a lot of students here, preparing for competitions, for your seminars. So I would be really grateful, I'm really feeling grateful that Dr. András Hárs has taken the time, has chosen our university, has chosen our college to come and deliver this thought-provoking lecture. Then I would thank our principal who has given us this responsibility of having this lecture. And whenever we faced any problems or any decisions to be made, as you know, our principal's door is always open. We can always approach him for anything, any small thing or bigger thing, and he was always ready to help us. This program wouldn't have been possible without the Manohar Parrikar School of Law and the faculty members there like Professor Vaibhavi Rane, Ms. Ruchika, Naik, Dr. Vijay, Gawas, Redkar. All of these people have played an incremental role in ensuring this program to its success. One unique thing, how did we coordinate this entire event? And even principal mentioned it earlier. It was entirely done on emails. Right from the beginning to the very end, there were no calls or no WhatsApp groups that we had with the university. But it was entirely done. And I always knew that Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos follows this similar approach. And although we are not sending someone to space, but I'll be happy some of you can go to Budapest from here. So then I would also acknowledge the support given by the administrator, MTS staff. Roshan is a BLLB student who's helped us with the mic. We're facing a lot of issues of mic since past few days, but he's got the thing right for us. Then my faculty co-coordinator, Varsha, Redkar, a lot of people who have enthusiastically turned up for this event because of her word of mouth publicity. And then I would also thank the student coordinator, Shamik, Kashaf Khan, and Akshat Gobe, various other people who were part of this event in ensuring all the plannings were done very smoothly to make my job very much easier. I would also thank the other volunteers who were part of this program, who were part of the CPL volunteers. Specific thanks to Britney for being a fabulous companion for this program, and also Shraddha Yadav for doing that beautiful painting on a very short notice and giving us a memory to take, giving him the memory to take from Goa to Budapest. Last but not the least, but all the audience who have turned up, made this interaction very fruitful, very engaging. Very thankful to all of you for joining and making this a very fruitful exercise for all of us. I'm sure the information will definitely benefit a lot of you. Now, if I have missed, even the faculty members, I would acknowledge them coming and sitting here. Professor Siddesh is there, other professors were there. So, thank you to each one of you. If at all I missed anyone's name, consider it was purely unintentional. And if my speech was long, like you know, the principal's door is always open to come play. Okay, so thank you so much.